Hey folks, welcome back. This is day 8 of basic design. This is an interesting day. It is largely made up of exercises. Got some crap on my screen here. Centering around the notions of balance. We talk a lot about balance in design. So often artists are trying to seek balanced compositions. And we start off with a lecture that I'll go through the slides in a moment, then some explorations where they've taken some of their compositions or some of their sets of small compositions that they then start doing physically. I like to kind of, my ethos is to do a lot of things physically because I think we are, well, until the metaverse, we are more innately able to move and see with our bodies by and large. Um, and for the students who aren't, it's a good practice anyways. And so we start with that, and then we go into the digital realm. And if you were like trying to track, what am I teaching technically? I don't talk about anything that the techniques that I teach in this video series. Yeah, pretty much, because those things are the easy things. How to use Photoshop and Illustrator, find those out online. Specifically, we're using rectangles and squares and rotating, and changing directions and learning how to work in Illustrator in general. And then the big technical thing that they're learning today is clipping masks, which is difficult to understand if you've never done it before, and it takes like 2 seconds to learn. So they're learning clipping masks in order to figure out how to play around and combine unified sets into compositions. What's the difference between a set of diverse things that are sort of related and then the holistic thing of a composition? And specifically, they're seeking balance. What do I mean when I say balance? Balance, yo. Um, I like to, talk about the physicality, and I ask the question, some art major in the class who understands balance better than some of the other folks. What am I talking about? And obviously, one of the things that comes out is something along the lines of, what is balance? Well, it's taking things and balancing them on a fulcrum. A lot of people do this with their hands, talking about finding a level, making sure things don't feel like they're tipping over. And in the realm of visual art, we mean visual weight and balance. So different things have different visual weight. But I like to ask the question that goes a little bit more rudimentary and a little bit more fundamental. Why do human beings enjoy balanced compositions? As I like to point out, there are multiple times when we use imbalance for design reasons. Usually they're incredibly purposeful. But in general, most paintings, most compositions will end up being balanced. And so understanding this and learning this is key as a designer. But why? I like to talk about the fact that we're embodied individuals and that since our ancestors decided to stand up and walk around on 2 feet, balance is the central problem to solve, like the first problem to solve when getting after most human motivations. Most human motivations involve seeing something and moving towards it. In order to do that, you have to be able to balance yourself. So if you watch a toddler, like think about their development from not like just taking things in, all of that until they start growing and they start learning words and they start kind of like seeing things and categorizing things pretty quickly. They get to the place where they start wanting to move. And, at first they're fine with crawling, but eventually they start walking. And the number one thing they're trying to figure out, and the thing they struggle with while walking, is how to balance those big noggins of theirs, those out of proportion noggins, um, and trying, to keep from falling. And this human proclivity towards balance is innately embedded in us because of the physiological problems we're trying to solve. And on top of that, there are other things in like our environment when it comes to like seeing a big boulder precariously on the top of a cliff, just barely balancing. Um, the notion that our ancestors who understood how precarious its balance was were the ones who did not, walk underneath it and die when it fell on them. So there's all kinds of environmental reasons why balance is important for having safe, comfortable environments. In the sense of these, biblical mandates: build your house on the rock. Um, you know, don't be like the waves. They're talking about the sort of normative experience of trying to have a life that your environment is just not trying to kill you all the time. that requires things like, even when we talk about like harmony or homemaking, most of the time these things are largely connected actually visibly with balance. So much so that like you can ask a child to draw a house and they will almost always draw a box with a triangle on top, a door, and a window on either side. It's very balanced, even though most houses don't even look like that anymore. Mine does, but it's funny. That's oddity compared. Most houses are just triple car garage door and then like a tiny door on the side. Um, it'll be interesting to know if children change that. So that's what we mean when we're talking about balance, and it can be largely thought of as this. I love these crappy seesaw images. They just work so well for this, though. So we've got these little ovoid people sitting on a seesaw. We all understand because they're equal weight. They balance out the scales. Now, the interesting thing about this is that visual weight doesn't quite work like physics, as in physics, you can drop two objects and they will accelerate and fall at the same time. And so there's some degree where a lot of things about actual physicality of balance doesn't quite add up. So for those of you who don't believe me, this was all that the big test with the Leaning Tower of Pisa and whatnot. But if you were to drop a bowling ball and a feather in a actual vacuum and a volume without any air in it, the bowling ball and the feather would hit the ground at the same time. There's a test of this on YouTube. I will link it somewhere up above. It's really fascinating to see this, that it's the air resistance that causes a feather to normally fall at a different rate. But this is not really the case for our visual processing. We see things that are bigger as heavier, whether they're heavier or not. And so in the realm of visuals, it's not necessarily aligning with physics, it's more aligning with human perception. I would call this the phenomena of being, like, how do human beings experience phenomena, and also like how do we do it pre our own cognition of reading into things. So a person who's well versed in physics will not think that the lighter object will fall faster than the heavier object, but almost everyone who does not have this kind of physics-based knowledge would guess that the heavier object would fall faster because there's something about that. It is more weighty on our mind. And so I think this has to do with the fact that you need to be more afraid of heavy objects falling on you than small objects and light objects. So we take a look at this. This is an example of symmetrical balance on a seesaw, but it's also an example of visual balance. So it's using the physical illustration to get across the visual weight thing. Let me show you an example of an unbalanced seesaw. So we have a larger figure on the right. Our brain understands these visual weights as I was talking about, and it kind of reflexively says this isn't accurate. Like, we all know that, boom, it would go down well, for me, I don't know how the mirroring works. It should be on the right. The heavier figure would go down and the other figure would go up. And then you'd have a more like kind of comfortable composition. We'd get a sense of where the land is, rather than what we see here. And I like to ask, how would we fix this? How would we make it more balanced? It's kind of without changing the scale of the figures. Like, if this is all we've got, how do we make it so that it actually does remain level? And that's where asymmetry comes in. You move the big figure towards the fulcrum in the middle, and now it can be balanced by something heavier, as long as you got that visual weight over there. This feels more comfortable than that. We call this asymmetry because it is not the same, it's not a mirror image on left and right like it is in a symmetrical composition, but it does end up balancing itself out, and we can feel this visually. So then we go through some examples to talk about how can this be used, etc. Something like this. I asked, what is this? Is it balanced? And I actually ran into some really weird things this year talking this through. I found that the students were not very able to assess this. The thing about assessing balance is that it happens way faster in visual processing than that meaning deriving, and sometimes even the categorization that happens in step 2. And it's more something that's felt. And I think the students were being over analytical. So like I might have a student who would come in here and look at this and be like, well, look, if I look very, very closely, this person is in a different position than this person. And that, maybe they like this, this person has their arm up to them. Maybe they like that better. And so their eye was drawn to it. And then they'd be like, well, because my eye was drawn to it, that means this doesn't have the same weight. And it's like, no, when we talk about balance, we're talking about that gestalt. Does the image appear balanced, even though as we start looking at details, we might then have an experience that weights certain parts of it more, but not in the sense of like when you first see it, I'm not worried that this building's going to fall over. Another example of symmetry from a similar art historical reference, the way in which this architecture is laid out. Think about the problems of architecture. Balance is huge for architecture. Literally, the buildings might fall over. So the fact that symmetry is often used in architecture is by nature of the fact that it's so much more stable in general. We look at some Piet Mondrian. Here's some examples of asymmetry. If you cut a line down the middle, either direction, either horizontally or vertically, they are not the same on the left and the right or the top and the bottom. If you cut a diagonal line, they're not the same on the top right and bottom left or vice versa. Instead, we have this very stable image, and that weight of the yellow in the top left is counterbalanced by the red, and then that little blue makes it so the two specks of red in the bottom right are not being thrown off, so to speak. They could, if you cover up that blue with your hand really quick and take a look at it, it's like, yeah, it slides heavy to the right, and you bring it back in, you're like, oh yeah, that stabilizes. It's like a feeling, not necessarily a literal measurement like a doctor on a scale. It's far more like, are you looking at it straight? Are you worried that you should have to tilt your head? What's happening? Here's another Mondrian. Very stable. Imagine trying to push this over. Like imagine this as a big block in space. You got to walk up next to it and push it with your hands. Is it going to tilt over and fall really easily? Are the things going to like scatter out of it? Or is it going to be chunky and remain there? That's what we're getting at. This is another example of asymmetry. These things are used to connotate different feelings, to attract us to them, to make us not immediately off put by the nature of the composition itself. That we might be invited in to look at it. This is why understanding balance is important for artists and designers. Then I started showing some Calder. These are really fun because these are sculptures. These are mobiles. So if you can see, it's kind of a crappy image for some reason. If you can see here, this actually is suspended by a wire here. And so everything to the left of this is somehow counterbalancing based on this weight. Of course, every time it swings back, it's doing like some interesting things. His mobiles are really unique and interesting, and they can move and change directions and spin with the wind in a lot of interesting ways. So it's physically balanced. But I like to ask students, is it as a photograph, is it balanced? And this is a fun one because I like to again point out, like I've talked about before, context and audience is important. But context, all the students who sit straight on like I am, they'll say, yeah, this is balanced. As soon as maybe I shouldn't turn my computer, but if I go over here, that right-hand side, you're shot up the composition, and I'm going to call it the paddle on the top right takes a lot of weight. And I'd still say it's pretty balanced, but it feels like I'm going to stay in the top right of the image and I'm not going to look at the bottom right. And then if you swivel back over here, suddenly you stop seeing that and you get shunted out of the composition and your eye comes down, which as a sculptor, I think this would excite Calder because it's calling for interaction, that the piece changes as you move around it. And it's just interesting to think about context and how balance can be perceived in space. Here's another Calder. This one, again, students were like kind of over analyzing it, which with the next one, I'll show you the technique I started developing to try to help them get in touch with their intuition because they just are not very intuitive. This is, again, I mentioned this on the first day. I really do agree with Ian McGilchrist and his assessment that we are overly left hemisphere dominated. And so they, like, someone looked at this and was like, well, yeah, it's got one leg on the right and two on the left. So that's unbalanced. When it's like, this is a physical thing, it's actually balanced. And I was like, okay, just imagine you're in that space and you give it a shove. Is it going to fall over? It's like, no, that leg, look at how far out that right hand leg extends. It will like balance a lot of push and shove. Um, if you just close your eyes and look at it really quick, does it, and then close your eyes, does it feel like it's falling? Like, it's stable, it's balanced, even despite the asymmetry that is here. So like I started doing this, I started letting them only see the image for like a second, which I'll do. I think it's the next one. Let me see. I like this one because I think there's a back and forth play where like before you realize what you're seeing, it's generally balanced. But as soon as you realize that this is empty space underneath the ball, the smaller ball, then it starts to get precarious. And I think there's something about knowing that abyss is there, that this ball could fall not to a tabletop, but to whatever is down here, that it charges it. Where like at first people think it's balanced, but then they're worried it's not. And so I like to use this one to say, like, context, audience, the way things are perceived. If we just came in with a line here, yeah, in general it'd be quite balanced. Maybe because this one's a little bit bigger, it'd be a little bit off balance. But there's something about the weight of the emptiness and then the smaller ball here that this artist is getting at balance there. Let's see if we can feel it on the quicker look. If I go to this one, feel it. Did it make you feel like uncomfortable, like things were falling over, or was it stable? I think in general that Kandinsky is balancing this chaotic composition in a bunch of different ways, from the similarities of the yellow and blue here to the blue and yellow here, and the triangles, the red and purple, the purple and red. There's all of these little relationships, counterbalances for almost every little thing, from like a blue with a yellow, with a blue with a yellow, and the pink nearby. All these things have these correlations where they're constantly linking across the composition, and then those triangles in the background setting up almost like a landscape stability of mountain range or something like that. There's a lot of ways where, and think about all the lines that are moving out of the composition and yet how your eye keeps diving back in. It's stable, even though some of the elements even feel like they're moving, but it's like stable enough that we aren't like falling out of it. Take a look at this one. I think this one's pretty unbalanced. I see it a lot as like a cityscape. I see there's like a dark building on the left that kind of tilts forward towards me. The one on the right kind of recedes away. There's these balls kind of floating down, falling in the space in the middle, and there's like a bunch of tilting. It definitely feels like a weird modern city while I'm kind of drunk or something, and it destabilizes. And this is where I like to talk about. So why wouldn't we always make balanced compositions? And I like to talk about some of those places where making someone feel uncomfortable is sometimes the intention. You can see this in horror films, like I've mentioned before. You can see it in thriller films. Like if the if a movie about, a movie starring Tom Cruise does not ever put you in a place where you think that that there's an imbalance of power, that Tom Cruise will never be able to be defeated, then you will not be on the edge of your seat, as they say. You need an imbalance where Tom Cruise, despite his ability to run, he needs to feel slow in comparison to someone else. That there needs to be an imbalance of power. And when you look at all the new movies, the fact that there's always some crazy all-knowing entity, despite how smart Tom Cruise is, he's never quite all-knowing enough, and that there's this overwhelming force that is way bigger than him, and it has way more knowledge and way more power, and it moves faster, and then he has to figure out how to rebalance the scales every time. It's like those kinds of things exist for a reason. Why did Kandinsky do this? I can't necessarily speak to that. Oftentimes he's using his synesthesia to try to get at the feeling of music, but I think there's tons of music, especially like music at the end of the night or at the end of a set, that kind of comes to a close and wraps it up. this kind of feels like that. Like this is the end of the night song, and I'm falling down because I'm too tired, sort of thing. So there's all kinds of reasons why we want to understand how to make unbalanced compositions, but we have to understand balance in order to do that, or else we're just, making things by accident and never at all being able to refine towards our hopes and dreams, etc. Um, we look at some more Kandinsky all over the place. Then we get to Hokusai. I like to talk about this one a lot. This one's funny. To ask the question, is it balanced? Um, this is the Great Wave, is its colloquial name. It is technically called a view of Mount Fuji. Um, Hopefully you're seeing the mountain there. If you follow the crest of the wave down, you'll notice that blue and white in the background is not another wave, it's a mountain. This is hard. This one I feel like it often undulates. Students have a hard time feeling if it's balanced or not. I would say this is like when you're feeling your body looking at it, are you tilting or do you end up kind of level? Do you feel like you know where the horizon line is going to be? It's not in the middle where horizon lines usually are. It's definitely down beneath the waves. But I feel like, yeah, like this is going to be a level land. But there's another form of symmetry. Like we'll see. Let me go to the flash through this to the last one. You'll see like symmetry doesn't have to be vertical or horizontal axes. It can be these radial things. It can do a lot of different things. So what is Hokusai doing here? If you blur your eyes and you look at the dark and light shapes, you'll notice if you trace the contours of the wave, it kind of creates this shape. And notice that the same shape is made in the inverse in the sky. So it's like we've got these linked together, like I can't do it very well with my hands with this camera. It's like they kind of link together in a way and hug each other, like almost like a yin and a yang. And there's some sense where it's like a radial symmetry that is an inverse and reflected. So it's like reflected over the side and then it's flipped up um, in some way, or like rotated around. So maybe it's right to say it's radial, but I think there's something really unique about that. And this is where I like to talk about. So we don't just do this to attract people's attention. Maybe we can do it for some interesting reasons. Specifically, like think about the title of this piece, A View of Mount Fuji, A View of Mount Fuji. Imagine you were making a view of Greg the artist, like down in your little corner. You probably see me still. Um, it's very rare that I would be that small. Imagine my video series, but I'm way back here. Like, no, like that wouldn't work. We the thing we want to look at, the thing we title the piece after, we put in the front and center so frequently, especially in the West. So what's happening here? There's something about Japanese culture in particular, that developed through their indigenous religion called Shinto, and then as it mixed with Chan Buddhism, and out of those two emerged Zen Buddhism. There's something about the culture and nature of Japan that I think this piece really captures, and that is, if you don't know, Japan is a island archipelago on the eastern side of Asia that extends through an area of the Pacific Rim that is all volcanic islands. So Mount Fuji is a dormant volcano, and it ties into a lot of the culture of Japan as a seafaring nation that built boats early on, and they spent a lot of time on the water catching fish and all of this. I mean, sushi comes from Japan, and they are eating a lot of fish and learning how to ride the waves. And so when we talk about the Ansel Adams Snake River, we think, why do people look at mountains? Well, this is a whole nother level of it. Think about, not only do you look at a mountain to get your bearings, but you do it because you're at sea on the water and you need to remember which way is home. So in a sense, like the view of Mount Fuji, there's lots of layers of meaning here. One is, hopefully you've noticed the boats now. Men at sea with a great wave coming in. Yeah, they're looking to Mount Fuji, and yeah, it's far away. So there's that level. The other level is there's something sort of like it's been called the floating world. And it's this notion of philosophy and, in some senses, theology, a cosmology about what is the world. You can see this often in Japanese art. It's most kind of popularly well known through the films of Miyazaki, like Princess Mononoke and The Boy and the Heron. How there's so often in Japanese visual culture these senses of floating, of moving upwards, of ethereal space and clouds and water and flow. And again, it comes from the nature of their geography, I think, and what that caused as a disposition within the national and the ethnic identity. And it kind of makes you think about this kind of place. You know, the Mount Fuji is a volcano. It's a powerful image, but it's a dangerous thing. And just like the ocean is a place where you might receive sustenance, these fishermen are not currently too worried about sustenance. You can see them all kind of bending over their oars, getting ready to have this wave crash upon them. You know, it's this thing that changes, it gives and it takes, and it's always flowing, and they have to bend to its wishes. I think about it like the compositional structure of balance seems to be constantly whirling, and you feel like you're always orbiting around this center. But sometimes you're on the upswing, and sometimes you're on the downswing, and sometimes you're in the way of the downswing. And now I start to see, like, you know, the theology and the philosophy of something like the yin and the yang, and that kind of moving it into the wave, the mountain, instability. Sometimes you just have to put your head down and ride out the storm and hope and perhaps pray if you're religious. You know, I think that there's ways in which all of these principles, elements, these things of design, when they're used thoughtfully and well, which does come from exploration, it's not just intention that is driving to that. But when you get to the place where you're a master of composition and you understand how different forms and things can move, you can create something like this that just keeps you spinning, keeps you rotating, keeps you seeing the foam and the wave crashing and the mountain, and there's like a serenity in it. I asked one of the students, you know, how does this make you feel? And they talked about serenity and calm and peace. And isn't that bizarre? You know, contrast that with another, you know, great wave kind of imagery or composition, and that would be the movie The Perfect Storm. I think there's like one or two moments in it where there's like just a profound sense of awe at the size of the waves, but there's not a serenity. It's sad, it's tragic, they're dying. This, you know, I think if this is a documentation of a real situation, which I'm sure plenty of people throughout Japan's history, and especially during the time of Hokusai, died on the seas. And Hokusai makes this piece. It's a usage of balance and flow and asymmetry that kind of gets across a statement of something along the lines of like this is how it is. We are riding these waves. And I think that's super powerful. We look at some other um, forms of asymmetry, causes a lot of serenity and whatnot of Hokusai. We talk about this in more detail, but I'm tired and I'm wrapping this up. This is one of my favorites here. Just kind of precarious, but I don't think anyone feels like that person, the child on the branch, is going to fall. Vast open space. Almost all of the things that we need to look at are here. And yet there's all of this other open space. And then I think the signatures here, there's a lot of history about how in Japan and China, how things are signed. They're not meant to be ignored. They're part of the composition. You know, they kind of make this nice bracketing. So I think it's a little subtle subconscious hint that if the person did fall, maybe there's something to grab onto before they fall into this river and die. And that kind of gives us that little safety net we need for it to not be unbalanced. If you cover it up with your thumb as you're looking at it, you can feel, yeah, it does get a little bit more precarious when I do that. Then they go off and do exercises, and they're trying to make balanced compositions. But this is how we think about it, how we begin to start to feel it and see it used through in various ways. The kind of stability of symmetry of like those cathedrals, and versus the kind of serenity and the flow of more asymmetrical compositions. So I don't tell the students if they can choose one. They can do either. They can do symmetrical or asymmetrical. Um, but yeah, that's what we focus on today, and that's what they practice. Hopefully you're getting a sense that this is a practice. You have to keep trying. You have to look. You have to observe a lot. You have to talk about it, and hence why just watching video essays on it is not good enough. Have a good weekend.